Ooh, this is going to be a tough watch. It's the final installment of our 5 non-negotiables of the left series, where we detail 3 short-term goals to take back the country and 2 long-term fights that must be waged for the sake of our democracy and the planet. The 5th entry speaks to the now backburnered but ever-present threat to life on this planet: climate change. Remember that? We used to talk about that. Now, this may be the most difficult case that I make to you, and I expect pushback and disappointment at first, but if I do my job, I'll shift you to acknowledgement and resolve. This 5th non-negotiable isn't necessarily for us. It's for someone you might know, but more than likely, it's for someone you'll never meet. The establishment of the Climate Trust, Social Security for the planet. Let's dig in. UNFTR! Oren Lyons, a faith keeper of the Haudenosaunee, said something that stuck with me in a climate documentary from 2007 titled The 11th Hour. He said, "The Earth has all the time in the world. We don't." See, the planet will heal and regenerate, eventually. Whether humans will be here to see it is another matter entirely. Either way, the path forward for our lifetimes has been set in stone. The most stubborn of facts that we need to meet head on. When I laid out this series, I started with more than 30 topics that I, and most on the left, believe are critical and urgent. Whittling it down to just 5 was more than just marketing. It was out of a desire to build a holistic framework with big but attainable goals that share 3 characteristics. They had to be defensible, practical, and conscience-shifting. Once this climate episode is put to bed, I'm going to do a tight but comprehensive recap on the 5 non-negotiables, why I chose them, and why they're in the order that they're in. So now let's address the defensibility and timing of the first 4 so we can properly introduce this 5th one. The first 3 non-negotiables are policies that have proven models: ending homelessness by adhering to the Housing First principles, healthcare as a human right through Medicare for All, and a meaningful work guarantee through a civilian labor corps. The 4th is to get money out of politics, the only way to save our democracy. But as I argued, the legislative path to achieving this has been foreclosed, leaving the only viable path as a constitutional amendment. I believe that this will take a full generation because it requires a supermajority. Ensuring a liberal supermajority means we need a supportive electorate, one that is sheltered, cared for, and employed. So let's talk about this 5th and final one: establishing the Climate Trust. This one has a 15 to 50-year horizon, but it needs to begin on day 1. So my gateway to the climate change discussion was in a 2005 book by an acerbic critic of fossil fuels and suburban sprawl named James Howard Kunstler. The book is called The Long Emergency: Surviving the End of Oil, Climate Change, and the Other Converging Catastrophes of the 21st Century. It came out a year before Al Gore's pseudo-documentary, An Inconvenient Truth. Between Kunstler's caustic, grumpy uncle voice and vituperative attitude toward rapacious behavior of oil and gas companies, I was hooked. In fact, I credit this book for my now 2-decade fascination with crude oil. But to say I was late to the game is an understatement. But as a practical matter, we're all late to the conversation because a scientist named Eunice Foote discovered the heat-trapping effect of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in 1856. Sadly, over the years, Kunstler attended the same fuckwit ashram as Matt Taibbi and has gone on a full MAGA grift. There must be something in the water at the Rolling Stone magazine that poisoned these guys. Maybe some leftover shit in the pipes that turned Hunter Thompson's brain into a pile of misogynistic and racist mush. But I digress. Kunstler's analysis was heavy on anecdotes and light on science. He was far more focused on the notion that we were running out of cheap oil than he was on the effects of carbon emissions into the atmosphere, though he does take note of it. What Kunstler was able to see clearly, however, was the impact that our quest for oil would have on the planet. Quote, "Social organization may be quite different in the decades ahead. But if we want the enterprise of civilization to continue as a general proposition, we'll have to keep the lights on. And the only way to do that by the mid-21st century will be by using nuclear reactors to generate electricity." So to be clear, I'm not specifically advocating for a pivot to nuclear energy, nor am I here to promote wind, solar, seaweed farms, green roofs, carbon capture, Afforestation, LED lights, regenerative fishing, electric cars, mass transit, protein substitutes, vertical farming, tidal energy, biodiversity over monoculture, Bitcoin mining bans, desalinization, decoupling, degrowth, and decarbonization of any kind. I mean, we have to do them all because they're necessary, and every one of those is on the expanded lists of policies that we need to pursue with all deliberate speed. I'm not advocating for them individually in the same way that I'm not here promoting exercise, a clean diet, and 8 hours of sleep. I stopped exercising a year ago. I eat like shit, and I haven't slept 8 straight hours without weed or bourbon since I had kids. I'm killing myself with eyes wide open. So who am I to preach about saving the planet? See, we know how to have a healthy planet, just like we all know to eat healthy food and get plenty of sleep and exercise. But if you're not in a mental, emotional, financial, and physical state to make these things happen, it doesn't matter. I'm paying more today for less tomorrow. We all are. Let me explain. Paying more today for less tomorrow. In his 2025 book, Climate Justice, Cass Sunstein talks about this phenomenon in great detail. As a former administrator in the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs and now Harvard professor, he was on the interagency task force under Obama charged with identifying the social cost of carbon, or SCC. Is it priced in terms of domestic impact or globally? Who's responsible for paying whom? What are we even paying for? Sunstein's group included members from the CEA and the Council on Environmental Quality and the Department of Agriculture, Commerce, and Energy, as well as the Department of Transportation, Environmental Protection Agency, National Economic Council, Office of Energy and Climate Change, Office of Management and Budget, Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Department of the Treasury, and a partridge in a pear tree. Everyone, it seems, but the Department of Defense. It was a pretty big deal. Just not big enough to include one department that was way ahead of all the others in terms of modeling climate change, and certainly a big part of the problem, but more on that later. Under Obama, the group did in fact put a price on carbon based on elements of 4 arguments: epistemic, interconnectedness, moral cosmopolitan, and reciprocity. If you want to know more about them, read the book. Otherwise, just know this: they put a lot of thought into it. Determining who to pay out, what projects to support, and who else would come along with us was all being considered under the working group after they determined the social cost of carbon. But the question of American consumer behavior remained a sticking point, because our consumption is, after all, the driver of the global economy. All social experiments to shift behavior, such as labels that clearly state, if you pay X more today for this efficient thing, you'll save Y over the next 10 years, were pretty unsuccessful, as you might imagine. Basically, for the same reasons I eat like shit, don't sleep enough, and stopped exercising. This life, this economy, the stress and anxiety that accompanies it all, and the self-indulgent goals we're supposed to have, it leads to something called present bias, or myopic loss aversion. Sunstein goes into great detail about trying to model our behaviors through incentives and information, something called choice engines. So basically, here are your options. We trust you'll make the right choice. The less choice, the more paternalistic the engine, and the more resistance from people and politicians that value liberty over life. And if you're thinking, where have I heard that one before? It sounds a lot like the gun control debate. Restricting consumption and dramatically altering the global economy through all, not some of the measures that I mentioned before, is entirely necessary to battle the effects of climate change. But when presented as options and choice, as shown in choice engines, the vast majority of the public will decline the more costly option today, even if it saves them a ton tomorrow. And it certainly doesn't sell when presented as some sort of loss of liberty. Look at how the right was able to latch onto banning plastic bags, plastic straws, or incandescent bulbs. Give me plastic or give me death! It's why running on a new Green New Deal or anything of the sort is a non-starter. There's no immediate benefit to be had. There's a perceived loss of liberty, and it will cost way too much in the short run. And we are, yes, just that selfish and stupid. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't pursue literally every single important measure once we've taken back control of the country. It's just that environmental issues are hard to hear if you're unemployed, unhoused, in over your head in debt, and lack critical access to health care. Remember, defensible, practical, and conscience shifting. The problem with these choice engines and our attitude toward them is that our consumption produces externalities, costs imposed on others outside of our decisions. So our addiction to fossil fuels, industrial agriculture, globalization, and growth at any cost has begun to ruin the whole planet, not just our little corner. And this is where I need to share some really bad news. The toothpaste is out of the tube. In fact, the tube's sitting in a landfill somewhere, and the toothpaste was spit down the drain a long time ago. To show you how dramatically the interpretation of our situation has shifted in just under 20 years, I'm going to read 3 quick passages from highly respected authors representing the past, present, and future of how the United States views climate change. The first is from Lester Brown's landmark book, Plan B 3.0, published in 2008. Quote, "Participating in the construction of this enduring new economy is exhilarating. So is the quality of life it will bring. A world where population has stabilized, forests are expanding, and carbon emissions are falling is within our grasp." End quote. Now the next is from Cass Sunstein's Climate Justice, released this year. Quote, "Wildfire, drought, extreme heat, and flooding are very much with us and bound to get worse. Adaptation is receiving increasing attention, and rightly so." And the future vision, as seen by author Tad DeLay in his book Future of Denial, The Ideologies of Climate Change. Quote, "Capital trudges along and charts new ways to reap profit from fires and wars, even as economies plummet into never-ending crises. Nationalists respond with growing demands for trade tariffs. Louder still are their roars for blood. Economic growth stalls out below 1%, and hopes of lessening inequality disappear. The start of the permanent depression, the normal and frightening kinds. The oligarchs close ranks and retreat to bunkers or walled cities, new fiefdoms, amusement parks for their rotting souls. That escalated quickly. Brick killed a guy." The optimism brimming in Brown's book is palpable and real, and it was from the third update from the original penned in 2003. And while well-intentioned, it relies on the myth of free market interventions to self-correct. The solutions offered at the time seem quaint in retrospect, caught in a capitalist fever dream of sorts at a time when Florida and T-Pain were topping the charts. Barack Obama just entered the presidential race, and Brangelina was a thing. And then Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy and the stock market collapsed. Big thinking on climate and investments into a Lester Brown-style future would just have to wait. Obama wasn't about to blow his political capital on a green economy initiative at a time when Americans were losing their homes and 401ks. But his administration also wasn't about to ignore it either. So it went into full policy and bureaucrat mode to build the aforementioned working groups. And if nothing else, we were going to have a framework for how to think about developing a plan that someday could be possibly implemented. 8 years of the Obama administration to develop a framework to calculate the dollar value of carbon. Now think back to Lester Brown's words around the same time. "Participating in the construction of this enduring new economy is exhilarating." That's the hangover of New Democrat thinking right there. The market got us into this, it'll get us out. All we have to do is figure out what the price of carbon is, put a dollar amount on it. So we joined the Paris Climate Agreement and told the world about our fancy new formula, created executive orders and agencies and working groups, and attempted to financialize our way out of this mess somehow. And after 8 years, progress was made. In fact, Obama bragged that under his stewardship, the economy and carbon emissions had, quote, decoupled. GDP grew faster than carbon emissions. In reality, we were in the midst of transitioning from coal to natural gas and experiencing anemic growth after the financial crisis. Not much else fundamentally changed, so when growth resumed, so did emissions. Oh, and something else happened at the end of Obama's term. The Democrats lost to Donald Trump. Every working group dismantled. Every executive order in the trash. The pandemic slowed Trump's role, but pretty much all that hard work determining the social cost of carbon went out the window. But honestly, did it matter? When Biden came into the office, they reinvigorated several of the committees and formulas. We rejoined the Paris Agreement, allocated trillions of dollars to repair our crumbling infrastructure, and sure, the vast majority of programs contemplated under the Green New Deal were left on the cutting room floor, but Schumer and Pelosi promised the Progressive Caucus that they would revisit them any minute now. Still waiting on that one. So what if Biden opened up drilling leases to increase fossil fuel production to the highest levels ever achieved by any country anywhere ever? We put a dollar value on carbon. Trillions of dollars in infrastructure spending, more oil and gas that we know what to do with, and so much money going to charging stations for Tesla. How did that work out? Oh, and tax credits. So many tax credits and options to monetize tax credits through direct pay provisions. So basically, organizations could, quote, elect to treat these tax credits as refundable payments of tax. Such entities are eligible to receive direct payments from the IRS for any amount paid in excess of their tax liability for credits. The Inflation Reduction Act also allows eligible taxpayers that are not tax-exempt entities to transfer all or a portion of certain tax credits, including the ITC and PTC, to an unrelated party. That's a direct quote from the EPA. How's that for action? We're all gonna fucking burn. Yeah. Listen, the Republican Party has turned into the most villainous, mean-spirited group of asshats in the world. But the Democrats, bless their hearts, so wonky, so well-intentioned, obsessed with the neoliberal New Democrat financialization of salvation policies. Outside of the fact that none of these policies work to actually reduce carbon emissions or mitigate the effects of climate change, there was another fatal flaw in the overall design, one that they couldn't possibly see coming. Because the big stuff like tax credits were all baked into omnibus spending bills and not really legislated. And because the task forces and the working groups were discretionary, and because executive orders governed most of the policies anyway, they left our climate initiatives, as meek as they were, exposed to unforeseen threats like, I don't know, losing an election to Donald Trump, something that had never happened. Oh, wait, that's right. This was the second fucking time. And so now here we are again. In a matter of weeks, it's all been undone and then some. But wait, there's more. In 1856, Eunice Foote wrote, "An atmosphere of that gas would give to our Earth a high temperature," describing the phenomenon we now know as the greenhouse effect. In 1863, John Tyndall followed up on Foote's findings and showed that molecules of water vapor, carbon dioxide, and ozone are the best absorbers of heat radiation. 1865, William Stanley Jevons wrote about the folly of efficiency, saying, "It is wholly a confusion of ideals to suppose that the economical use of fuel is equivalent to a diminished consumption. The very contrary is the truth." So this became known as the Jevons paradox, essentially stating that advances in fuel efficiency would lead to more consumption, not less. So if you're not into Civil War era science that endures to this day, let's go to the turn of the century. 1896, Svante Arrhenius calculated how variations in atmospheric CO2 concentrations could influence Earth's surface temperature. Still not convinced? All right, let's take a huge leap forward then. In 1978, Exxon scientists wrote internal memos about the greenhouse effect and predicted the collapse of the western Antarctic ice sheet, multi-meter sea level rise, and widespread flooding. So, they launched a misinformation campaign nearly a decade before the public ever heard the term global warming. In 1990, a report issued by the Naval War College predicted that, quote, "Nearly every aspect of the world's political, cultural, and economic interests will be affected. Basic human needs, such as water supply and quality, food production, and health conditions, are threatened within the developing nations. In some low-lying coastal nations, large segments of populations may become environmental refugees, stressing neighboring nations' resources and goodwill by their forced migration to safer ground." End quote. In 2007, the Pentagon published National Security and the Threat of Climate Change under Bush. In it, they asserted the coming decades would include extreme weather events, drought, flooding, sea level rise, retreating glaciers, habitat shifts, and increasing spread of life-threatening diseases. 2008, the CIA released a report titled National Security Implications of Global Climate Change to 2030, in which they predicted, quote, "Intra and interstate conflict, particularly over access to increasingly scarce water resources," end quote. 2014, the Department of Defense wrote, quote, "Climate change will affect the Department of Defense's ability to defend the nation and poses immediate risks to U.S. national security," end quote. Here's the thing. Single events don't really scare the military. What scares them is what they call a threat multiplier, a confluence of extreme weather, causing food and water scarcity, and supply chain disruptions that lead to hyperinflation and economic collapse, which leads to uprisings, violence, and mass migration. We know how we got here. So if you're on the left and inclined to believe climate scientists, authors, and researchers, or if you're on the right and inclined to believe private industry and the US military, everyone is saying the same thing. Now, this is the part where I would typically tie in some of our previous findings and relate them to our other non-negotiables. Perhaps I would give you a pep talk about how we eliminated chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, and hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, from the atmosphere because we trusted the scientists who told us that the release of these elements were blowing a hole in the ozone, literally the thing that kept my entire generation up at night, along with nuclear war with Russia and quicksand. And how scientists discovered in 2017 that the ozone was beginning to repair itself and the hole was shrinking because we adhered to something called the Montreal Protocol, and we kept our promises. Industry, government, citizens, and the scientific community all working together across the Carter and Reagan administrations to solve an existential crisis facing humanity. Or how the Rodale trials, which began in earnest in 1981, produced the longest side-by-side comparisons of organic and conventional grain cropping systems in North America and found that, quote, organic farms are competitive with conventional yields after a 5-year transition period and produce yields up to 40% higher in times of drought. Farmers can earn 3 to 6 times greater profits. Organic farms leach no toxic chemicals into the waterways, use 45% less energy, and release 40% fewer carbon emissions. I tie this all into our civilian labor corps non-negotiable because making this information actionable means that we need more farmers. And how we'd have to train them because we would also need to limit acreage dedicated to monoculture crops to generate more biodiversity. The need for more organic, biodiverse farming and fishing practices means more jobs. It's all just the perfect alignment. These are big ideas that have real promise. Now imagine realigning our economy to promote the things that we mentioned at the beginning of this. Imagine a global initiative to generate carbon-trapping seaweed beds in the ocean, to commit ourselves to wind, solar, hydroelectric, and nuclear power, green roofs and electrified mass transit in our urban areas, protein substitutes, vertical farming, tidal energy, biodiversity over monoculture, Bitcoin mining bans, desalinization, decoupling, degrowth, and decarbonization of any kind. We have so many answers to get to a net zero emission future. And according to the science, if it all happened tomorrow, then in 50 years, we could begin to bring the Earth's temperature back to the current equilibrium. If we did all of it tomorrow. You see, carbon is cumulative. And what was set in motion 50 years ago is what we're living with today. That's how this works. Making it even more shameful, knowing that 35 years ago, the Pentagon already knew this was going to happen. 50 years ago, ExxonMobil knew. 130 years ago, Svante Arrhenius knew. And 170 years ago, Eunice Foote knew. The science has been there all along. It's religion that's holding us back. The doctrine of capitalism and consumption. The doctrine of more. Population control and global degrowth would be the fastest, most effective way to halt global warming. In other words, complete and utter social and economic collapse, the end of everything that we hold dear. The next best thing would be to do all the things that I mentioned above starting tomorrow, so that 50 years from today, we start to restore the balance to the Earth's ecosystem. Remember, we're always 50 years away from when we do all the things that we need to do. Nobody wants option 1. And I think we all know option 2 is doable, but not tomorrow. That's why I'm pushing hard for the first 3 non-negotiables to take back our country and the 4th to take back our democracy. All the while, we have to push to fundamentally alter our economic system to prepare for this restoration of balance through huge and interconnected environmental plans that will help us heal and prepare for what's to come. You see, climate justice is baked into every non-negotiable. We have to think about it that way. But even our most optimistic framework leads to a foregone conclusion. We fucked up. And we owe it to our kids and our grandkids to do something about that. What I propose for our 5th non-negotiable is a new trust, the climate trust. Basically, social security for the planet. Here's how it would work. In conjunction with lifting the cap on Social Security deductions to ensure the solvency and fairness of the Social Security Trust in perpetuity, I submit that every Social Security tax dollar collected above earnings of $400,000 per individual or household transfers to a climate trust. This solves our Social Security cap issue, helps chip away at income inequality, and allows us to build a trust for the future. Here's some basic back-of-the-napkin math. Individuals or households that earn over this amount make up about 2 to 3% of income earners, but represent 15 to 20% of all income. Translating this into dollars, if total personal income in the United States was around $22 trillion in 2023, then the top 2 to 3% of income earners took in around $4 trillion. A 6% tax above that threshold on these earnings would net the trust anywhere between $150 and $200 billion per year. Then we lock it up to earn interest for 15 years. Can't touch a penny of it until 2040, the year that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, expects we will reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperature threshold, the so-called point of no return. If all the scientists are right, and we've properly fucked the planet, then future policymakers will have the ability to break the trust and pay for the damage. The only provision of breaking the trust is the allocation of domestic and global funds, 78% for ourselves, 22% for climate refugees from other parts of the globe. That's the estimated cumulative contribution to carbon from 1850 to 2021 by the United States alone. 22% of all emissions, despite having 5% of the population, because you know what? We're the best. Now, why lock it up? Because we can't be trusted. We blew it. We're those shitty parents who work their whole lives to hoard money while ignoring their family. So I suggest we just leave it to our kids and grandkids. Like the robber baron who dies miserable and alone, having alienated anyone who ever loved them, leaving their probate attorney to distribute the funds with an apology note. An unrestricted, untaxed distribution to the world. By the way, Republicans love that shit. Unrestricted, untaxed. That'll speak to them. If we're lucky enough to turn back the tide of fascism and regain control of the country by focusing on our first 3 non-negotiables of the left, then we still have time to implement some or all of the policies and actions mentioned above to mitigate the harmful effects of climate change. But with the knowledge that we might not be here to see it, because that's just how science works. And we'll only get there if we achieve the 4th non-negotiable of getting money out of politics, which we already demonstrated will take at least a generation. A lot has to go right in this equation, but it's worth fighting for the lives of our children and grandchildren if we're to believe in anything. See, the climate trust is an admission that, yeah, we failed, but that we believe in them. We believe in the future. At this point, it's literally the best we can do. Here endeth the lesson. Oh my goodness, if you made it this far, you are a true champion. So if you dig this and you saw the other non-negotiables and you're not yet subscribed to the channel or getting our free weekly newsletter by going to UNFTR.com to sign up for it, you'll miss out on the capstone, which is putting this all together, and then the release of our curriculum in which we distribute materials that tell you how to advocate for all 5 non-negotiables to help us beat back the tide of fascism. We're hoping that you put together working groups of your own to study these materials, come up with social assets that we can distribute en masse, messaging that we can adhere to, and then bringing some other reputable people in the leftist spaces together to coalesce behind these messages. So remember, UNFTR.com for the newsletter. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.